In the winter of 1895, the very foundations of American commerce would be shaken by the discovery of a single insurance investigator from New York. Within the ledgers of Pennsylvania's most trusted insurance company lay hidden the evidence of the most elaborate mass murder scheme in our nation's history. For over 36 years, the deaths of more than 2,000 men, women, and children had been systematically orchestrated by the Eternal Life Insurance Company, all for profit. Pillars of their community and devout churchgoers, the Blackstone family had turned murder into an art form, building an empire on blood and insurance fraud. What investigator Thomas Henley uncovered in those frozen Pennsylvania hills wasn't merely financial corruption. It was a methodical genocide, disguised as business, where human lives were nothing more than numbers on a balance sheet. Before the story of the Blackstone family and their deadly empire continues, I must ask you something. This channel isn't for everyone, but only for those brave enough to face the darkest corners of American history. If you're ready to uncover secrets that powerful people tried to bury forever, ring the notification bell and hit that subscribe button, telling me in the comments what state you are listening from. I have a feeling this story will hit closer to home than you might expect. So disturbing was the truth about what happened in those Pennsylvania valleys between 1859 and 1895 that even today, certain records remain sealed in basement archives, marked with warnings that few dare to ignore. The year was 1859, and unprecedented growth was being experienced by the rolling hills of south-central Pennsylvania. Quiet farming communities had been transformed into bustling industrial centers by the discovery of coal deposits and the expansion of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Almost overnight, Mill Creek Township, nestled between the Susquehanna River and the Appalachian foothills, found itself at the heart of this transformation. Into this landscape of opportunity arrived Macabre Blackstone with his two younger brothers, Isaiah and Jebediah. From Connecticut is where the Blackstones claimed to hail, though their accents carried hints of something more exotic, perhaps European, though no one could place it exactly. What mattered to the good people of Mill Creek Township wasn't the Blackstones' origin, but what they had brought with them. They brought capital, ambition, and an almost supernatural understanding of human nature. A commanding presence that made men listen and women blush was possessed by Macabre, the eldest at 42. Directly into a person's soul, his steel-grey eyes seemed to peer, reading their deepest fears and desires with unsettling accuracy. The numbers man was Isaiah, 38, thin as a rail with fingers that danced across ledger books like a pianist's across keys. The family's public face was served by the youngest, Jebediah, barely 35. Blessed with the kind of warm smile and firm handshake that could sell ice to Eskimos, the brothers quickly established themselves in Mill Creek Township's social hierarchy. An imposing three-story Victorian that had belonged to the late Judge Morrison was purchased by them, the largest house on Elm Street, and they immediately set about hosting elaborate dinner parties for the town's elite. The Rotary Club was joined by Macabre. Treasurer of the Merchants Association became Isaiah, and Sunday school at First Presbyterian Church was taught by Jebediah. But it was their business venture that truly captured the community's trust and attention. On October 15, 1859, the Eternal Life Insurance Company opened its doors in a modest storefront on Main Street. More perfect, the timing couldn't have been. A new class of working families with steady incomes, but dangerous jobs, had been created by Pennsylvania's industrial boom. Good wages were offered by coal mining, steel production, and railroad construction, but they also offered good ways to die young, leaving widows and orphans with nothing but empty pantries and grief. This fear was understood intimately by the Blackstones, and they crafted their sales pitch with surgical precision. A financial product wasn't all that life insurance was, they explained. It was a moral obligation. A man who failed to provide for his family's future was no better than a man who abandoned them while he lived. For just $2 a month, less than most men spent on tobacco, a worker could guarantee his family would never face poverty, no matter what dangerous fate might befall him. Beyond belief, the policies were generous. Coverage worth $2,000, more than 6 years of wages, could be purchased by a standard worker earning $15 a week. Even more remarkably, the Blackstones offered immediate coverage with minimal medical examinations and no waiting periods. Invasive physical examinations and extensive paperwork were required by other insurance companies, But eternal life insurance made the process almost embarrassingly simple. Trust is the foundation of all commerce, Murray would say during his speeches at the Merchants Association. We trust our neighbors to be honest about their health and circumstances, and they trust us to honor our commitments when tragedy strikes. Wholeheartedly, the community embraced this philosophy. In Mill Creek Township alone, over 300 families had been enrolled by eternal life insurance by Christmas of 1859. Throughout Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio, policies were being sold by agents working on commission by the following summer. Everything Americans believed about opportunity and hard work seemed to be validated by the Blackstone's success. As strangers they had arrived, and through innovation and dedication, they had built a thriving business that served their community's genuine needs. Glowing profiles of the brothers were featured in local newspapers, praising their business acumen and civic participation. What no one noticed were the small details that, in hindsight, should have raised alarm bells. Why were claims paid so quickly by the Blackstones, often delivering cash payments to grieving families within days of a death, when other insurance companies required weeks or months of investigation? Why did their agents spend so much time at local saloons buying drinks for miners and railroad workers, asking detailed questions about work schedules and safety protocols? Why did Jebediah always seem to know about industrial accidents before the news reached the local papers? Most puzzling of all, why were such detailed files on their policyholders' daily routines, work schedules, family relationships, and financial difficulties maintained by the Blackstones? Filing cabinets filled with information that seemed to go far beyond what any insurance company would need were contained in Isaiah's office. But these questions wouldn't be asked for many years. In 1860, the Blackstones were simply the most successful businessmen in Mill Creek Township. Pillars of the community who had solved one of working-class America's greatest problems, the fear of leaving one's family destitute. On a bitter February morning in 1861, just as the nation was tearing itself apart over slavery and states' rights, the first death occurred. February 14, 1861. Gray and bitter, Valentine's Day dawned in Mill Creek Township with temperatures hovering near zero and a wind that cut through wool coats like a blade. 4 months, the Susquehanna Iron Works had been operating at full capacity, fulfilling government contracts as the nation braced for war. The night shift in the foundry had been worked by Heinrich Müller, tending the massive furnaces that turned raw ore into the steel that would soon make cannons and railroad tracks. One of the foundry's most experienced workers was Heinrich, at 34. A German immigrant who had learned his trade in the industrial mills of Pittsburgh before settling in Mill Creek Township with his wife Anna and their 3 young children. One of Eternal Life Insurance's first customers had been Heinrich, convinced by Jebediah Blackstone's passionate Sunday school lesson about a man's duty to provide for his family's future. A fortune had seemed like the $2,000 policy to Heinrich, who earned barely $12 a week. Anna had cried with relief when the policy documents were shown to her by Heinrich, knowing that their children would never face the grinding poverty she had known as a child in Bavaria, no matter what happened. A tragic industrial accident would be recorded in the county coroner's report for what happened in the early hours of February 14. According to witnesses, the mechanism that controlled the flow of molten iron from the main furnace to the casting molds was being adjusted by Heinrich. Trouble for weeks had been given by the lever system, sometimes sticking, sometimes releasing too quickly, but the foundry's owner, Samuel Hartwell, had insisted they could wait until spring for expensive repairs. At approximately 2:47 a.m., something went catastrophically wrong. Thomas O'Brien, working the adjacent station, later told investigators that he heard Heinrich curse in German, followed by the sound of metal grinding against metal. Heinrich struggling with the main release lever, which appeared to be stuck in the closed position, was seen by Thomas when he looked up. To dangerous levels, the furnace pressure was building. The ominous groaning of the containment chamber could be heard by all. Manually, Heinrich was trying to release the pressure. He was pulling on that lever with all his strength, Thomas told the coroner, and I could see the sweat on his face, even in that cold foundry. Then suddenly, the whole mechanism gave way at once. A nightmare of superheated metal and human agony was what followed. The release mechanism didn't just open, it shattered completely, sending a torrent of molten iron cascading across the foundry floor. Instantly killed was Heinrich, caught directly in the path of the flow. However, the molten metal didn't just claim one life. A stack of lumber stored near the furnace was ignited by the cascade, and the resulting fire claimed 2 more workers who were trapped when a support beam collapsed. 3 men dead, 3 eternal life insurance policies, 3 families that would receive immediate payment from the Blackstone brothers. But a picture that was both tragic and oddly convenient was painted by the details that emerged in the following days. First, there was the matter of the faulty lever mechanism. Samuel Hartwell swore that his maintenance foreman, Jacob Walsh, had declared the system safe just 3 days earlier. However, when investigators tried to interview Walsh, they discovered he had left town abruptly on February 12, claiming a family emergency in Philadelphia. Never again was Walsh seen in Mill Creek Township, and letters sent to the Philadelphia address he had provided were returned as undeliverable. Second, there was the curious timing of the accident. Normally, the night shift had 6 workers, but on February 14, only 4 men were present. 2 had called in sick with influenza, though both were seen in perfect health at McGinty's Tavern later that same evening, buying drinks and celebrating their good fortune at avoiding what they called a close call. Third, there was the matter of the lumber storage. Insisted by foundry workers was that flammable materials were never stored near the furnaces. The most basic safety rule in their dangerous profession, it was. Yet on the night of February 14, a full cord of seasoned oak had been stacked precisely where the molten iron would flow if the release mechanism failed catastrophically. Most puzzling of all was the response of the Blackstone brothers themselves. While the bodies were still being pulled from the wreckage, Jebediah Blackstone appeared at the foundry, claiming he had heard the explosion from his home 3 miles away. Immediately, he took charge of notifying the victims' families, personally escorting Anna Muller, Margaret O'Brien, and Sarah Thompson to identify their husbands' remains. By the time the sun set on February 14, all 3 widows had been visited by Isaiah Blackstone, who presented them with immediate cash settlements of their full policy amounts. "It's what Heinrich would have wanted," Isaiah told Anna Muller as he pressed $2,000 in gold coins into her trembling hands. "A quick settlement, so you and the children won't suffer any additional hardship during your time of grief." The Blackstones' compassion and efficiency impressed the community. 4 months, other insurance companies might drag out claims, demanding investigations and second opinions, but Eternal Life Insurance treated their policyholders like family. Evidence of the brothers' Christian values and business integrity was seen in the rapid settlements. Only one person seemed troubled by the suspicious circumstances surrounding the foundry fire. Mill Creek Township's physician and county coroner, Dr. Elias Crawford, had examined hundreds of industrial accident victims during his 20-year career. Immediate suspicions would have been raised by the deaths of the 3 foundry widows if they had occurred in Mill Creek Township, but scattered across 3 different states, they appeared to be nothing more than cruel coincidences in lives already marked by tragedy. In her Philadelphia boarding house on September 3, 1861, Anna Muller was found dead. After other tenants complained about a terrible smell emanating from her room, the landlord discovered her body. Accidental poisoning was determined by the city coroner as Anna's cause of death, apparently consuming a bottle of patent medicine that contained lethal amounts of mercury. In their beds were found her 3 children, ages 6, 8, and 11, victims of what appeared to be the same tragic mistake. A gas leak in the modest house she had purchased with her husband's insurance money was attributed to Margaret O'Brien's death in Pittsburgh. By neighbors after failing to appear at Sunday services, she and her 2 young sons were discovered. Noted in the Pittsburgh police report was that the gas valve in the kitchen had been left open, apparently by accident, filling the house with deadly fumes while the family slept. Longest lasted Sarah Thompson, surviving until November before succumbing to what Cleveland physicians diagnosed as consumption, tuberculosis that had apparently progressed with unusual speed and virulence. Within days of their mother, her 4 children died, victims of the same disease. 13 people dead. 13 lives that had been protected by Eternal Life Insurance policies, then extinguished within months of receiving their settlements. But separated by hundreds of miles and different jurisdictions, the pattern remained invisible to authorities who had no reason to connect tragic accidents in Pennsylvania with gas leaks in Pittsburgh or disease outbreaks in Cleveland. Meanwhile, The Blackstone brothers continued to build their empire with methodical precision. Into Ohio, West Virginia, Maryland, and Virginia had eternal life insurance expanded by the end of 1861. More than 50 agents across 5 states were employed by them, each trained in the Blackstone method of identifying and recruiting ideal customers. According to the manual Isaiah had written for new agents, the ideal customer was a working man between the ages of 25 and 45 with a dangerous job, a loving family, and no significant debts or connections to powerful people who might ask uncomfortable questions if he died unexpectedly. Perfect were coal miners. Excellent were railroad workers. All fit the profile: factory hands, foundry workers, and construction laborious. Generally avoided were farmers, shopkeepers, and professionals unless they possessed some other attractive quality, perhaps a gambling habit or drinking problem that might explain an untimely demise. Detailed instructions on how to gather intelligence about potential policyholders were contained in the Agent Training Manual, which would later be discovered in Isaiah's personal safe. Taught were agents to frequent saloons, barbershops, and boarding houses, engaging in casual conversations that would reveal crucial information about work schedules, family relationships, debts, and personal habits. A successful agent, the manual instructed, knows his customers better than they know themselves. He understands their weaknesses, their fears, their routines, and their connections to the community. Knowledge is the foundation of all successful insurance underwriting. More disturbing sections were also contained in the manual, detailing how to identify potential complications, people who might ask difficult questions if a policyholder died unexpectedly. Included in these complications were physicians, lawyers, journalists, law enforcement officers, and prominent citizens who might have the influence to demand thorough investigations. For each potential complication, specific strategies for neutralization were provided by the manual. Some could be bribed, others could be intimidated, a few might require more permanent solutions. Far beyond simple insurance fraud had the Blackstone operation evolved by 1863. A vast network of corrupted officials, hired killers, and cooperative witnesses that stretched across multiple states had been created by them. Joined by Sheriff Doughty in Pennsylvania had been police chiefs in Ohio, coroners in West Virginia, and judges in Maryland, all of whom had discovered that cooperation with the Blackstone family was far more profitable than honest law enforcement. By a carefully selected team of specialists were the actual murders carried out, each with particular expertise in creating accidents that would fool cursory investigations. There was Patrick the Torch McGillicuddy, an Irish immigrant who could make any building burn in a way that appeared accidental. Doc Samuel Henderson understood poisons and chemicals with the precision of a trained pharmacist. The engineer Marcus Kowalski could sabotage industrial equipment so skillfully that the resulting failures seemed like natural wear and tear. For substantial fees, these men worked, typically between $100 and $500 per assignment, but they were paid from a fund that generated thousands of dollars in profit from each successful claim. Brutally simple were the economics. For every dollar spent on murder, at least $4 in insurance payouts was earned by the Blackstone brothers. More importantly, the systematic elimination of widows and surviving family members meant that their crimes generated no living witnesses. About suspicious conversations with insurance agents, dead men could not testify. About unusual circumstances surrounding their husbands' deaths, dead widows could not hire lawyers to investigate. About the family tragedies that had claimed their parents, dead children could not grow up harboring suspicions. A perfect system it was, refined through years of experience and protected by a wall of corruption that seemed impenetrable. The only problem was scale. Across 6 states, more than 200 death claims per year were being processed by Eternal Life Insurance by 1865, even allowing for the genuine accidents and natural deaths that occurred among their policyholders. Nearly 3 times higher than the industry average was the mortality rate of Eternal Life customers. However, a relatively new field in the 1860s was statistical analysis, and most insurance companies relied on crude actuarial tables that couldn't detect sophisticated patterns of fraud. Either working for the Blackstone brothers or persuaded to focus their attention elsewhere were the few mathematically trained professionals who might have noticed the anomalies. That something was terribly wrong with Eternal Life Insurance had begun to be suspected by Dr. Elias Crawford, still serving as Mill Creek Township's coroner. Access to death records from multiple counties was given to him by his position, and he had started maintaining his own private database of suspicious deaths involving eternal life policyholders. Evidence of 47 deaths that exhibited unusual circumstances was contained in Dr. Crawford's files by 1867. Industrial accidents involving recently serviced equipment, house fires in buildings with newly installed gas lines, disease outbreaks that struck only insured families, and transportation accidents that seemed to target specific passengers. Undeniable was the pattern becoming. But a crucial problem was faced by Dr. Crawford. He had no authority to investigate crimes across state lines, and every local official he approached with his concerns had either dismissed his theories as coincidence or actively discouraged his research. Particularly hostile to Dr. Crawford's inquiries had become Sheriff Doughty, warning him that spreading unfounded accusations about respected businessmen could result in serious legal consequences. With a friendly smile, the threats were delivered, but Dr. Crawford understood the underlying message perfectly. Still, the physician continued his documentation, driven by a sense of professional duty and personal outrage. A family destroyed, children orphaned, and a community's trust violated was represented by each suspicious death. Even if justice seemed impossible, the truth needed to be documented by someone, somewhere. What Dr. Crawford didn't realize was that his activities had not gone unnoticed by the Blackstone brothers. About Dr. Crawford's private investigation had been learned by Isaiah, whose network of informants included clerks, secretaries, and office workers throughout the region, by early 1868. Exactly the kind of complication that the Blackstone manual warned against was represented by the doctor's persistent questions and detailed record-keeping. From his evening rounds on March 15, 1868, Dr. Crawford failed to return home. The next morning, his horse was found, standing calmly beside Willow Creek, 2 miles east of town. In the saddle was Dr. Crawford's medical bag, but there was no sign of the doctor himself. 3 days lasted the official search, involving more than 100 volunteers from Mill Creek Township and surrounding areas. Personally led the effort Sheriff Doughty, expressing deep concern for the welfare of such a respected member of the community. On the 4th day, Dr. Crawford's body was discovered, floating in a deep pool nearly 6 miles downstream from where his horse had been found. That the physician had apparently suffered a heart attack while crossing the creek, fallen from his horse, and drowned in the swift current was determined by the county coroner, Dr. Crawford's own assistant, Dr. James Morrison. For a man in his 60s who worked long hours under considerable stress, it was a plausible explanation. The only suspicious element was the absence of Dr. Crawford's private files, which had apparently been removed from his office sometime between his disappearance and the discovery of his body. When questioned about the missing documents, Dr. Morrison explained that he had taken the liberty of disposing of Dr. Crawford's personal papers to spare the family any embarrassment. Some of the files, he explained, contained unfounded theories and accusations that might damage reputations if they became public. Personally recruited by Isaiah Blackstone had been Dr. Morrison, a young man fresh from medical school in Philadelphia, and he was earning a substantial supplemental income for his cooperation with Eternal Life Insurance. Invaluable to the Blackstone operation over the coming decades would prove his willingness to cover up evidence and falsify official reports. With Dr. Crawford eliminated and his evidence destroyed, the Blackstone brothers felt secure enough to expand their operations into new territories and more ambitious schemes. But they had underestimated both the scope of their activities and the persistence of those who would eventually bring them to justice. A turning point in the Blackstone operation was marked by the year 1870, though it would be decades before anyone understood the significance of the changes that began to unfold in that pivotal year. From America's continued industrial expansion and the massive immigration waves that followed the Civil War arose an unexpected opportunity that was the catalyst. Into Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia were pouring hundreds of thousands of European immigrants, seeking work in the coal mines, steel mills, and railroad construction projects that were transforming the American landscape. The ideal customer base for Eternal Life Insurance was represented by these immigrants, men with dangerous jobs, limited English, few social connections, and desperate needs to provide security for their families. More importantly, they came from countries where official records were spotty or non-existent, making it almost impossible for American authorities to verify their backgrounds or track their relatives. Immediately, Murray Blackstone recognized the potential. During a family meeting in the spring of 1870, he outlined a new phase of their operation that would dwarf everything they had accomplished previously. "Gentlemen," he told his brothers in the privacy of their Elm Street mansion, "too small have we been thinking. We have been harvesting fruit from individual trees when we should be clearing entire orchards." Breathtaking in its ambition and horrifying in its implications was the plan that emerged from that meeting. Instead of targeting individual policyholders for elimination, the Blackstone brothers would begin orchestrating mass casualty events that could kill dozens of insured workers simultaneously. Enormous insurance payouts could be generated by industrial disasters, transportation accidents, and building collapses while appearing to be tragic but explicable accidents. Careful planning and precise execution were the key. They would need to identify locations where large numbers of their policyholders worked or gathered, then engineer disasters that would appear completely natural while maximizing casualties among insured individuals. The Morgantown coal mine in West Virginia was their first target, where more than 60 eternal life policyholders were employed in various capacities. A company that had been cutting costs aggressively to maximize profits during the post-war economic boom owned the mine, Harrison Industries. 3 months spent the engineer Marcus Kowalski studying the Morgantown operation, posing as a safety inspector and equipment maintenance specialist. That the mine's ventilation system was woefully inadequate and that dangerous levels of methane gas were accumulating in several deep shafts was revealed by his analysis. At 2:17 p.m. during the peak of the afternoon shift on October 12, 1870, an explosion ripped through the Morgantown mine. Attributed to methane ignition caused by a spark from mining equipment, the blast killed 47 workers instantly and trapped another dozen in collapsed tunnels. Only 8 men survived, and 3 of those died from their injuries within days. 56 men dead, 38 eternal life insurance policies, more than $76,000 in claim payments. By state officials who had no reason to suspect anything beyond criminal negligence by Harrison Industries was handled the investigation into the Morgantown disaster. Heavily fined was the company, and it faced numerous civil lawsuits, but the explosion itself was classified as an industrial accident caused by inadequate safety measures and poor ventilation design. What investigators didn't discover was that subtle modifications to the mine's ventilation system had been made by Marcus Kowalski 3 weeks before the explosion. Changes that ensured methane would accumulate to explosive levels in precisely the areas where the largest concentrations of eternal life policyholders were working. That mass casualty events were the future of their enterprise was convinced the Blackstone brothers by the success of the Morgantown operation. Across 4 states over the following 5 years, they orchestrated 8 major disasters, claiming more than 300 lives and generating insurance payouts exceeding $400,000. There was the collapse of the Riverside Bridge outside Pittsburgh in 1872, which killed 23 workers during construction, 19 of whom carried eternal life policies. Faulty design and substandard materials were blamed by the official investigation, never discovering that key support beams had been deliberately weakened with acid compounds. 6 city blocks were consumed by the Great Fire of Cumberland, Maryland, in 1874, claiming 41 lives, including 32 eternal life policyholders who had been attending a company-sponsored social event at the Merchants Hall. For that fire, Patrick the Torch McGillicuddy had spent weeks preparing, strategically placing accelerants and blocking fire exits to ensure maximum casualties among the target population. Perhaps their most audacious operation was the sinking of the steamboat Catherine and on the Ohio River in 1875. In calm weather, the boat went down with the loss of 67 passengers and crew. 43 of the victims carried eternal life policies that had been sold to them just days before their departure by agents working the immigrant docks in Pittsburgh. By local authorities who lacked the resources, expertise, or motivation to detect sophisticated sabotage was each disaster investigated. The jurisdictional limitations and communication failures of 19th-century law enforcement had become mastered by the Blackstone brothers at exploiting. More importantly, they had developed an increasingly sophisticated network of corruption that extended far beyond small-town sheriffs and country coroners. State legislators, federal judges, railroad executives, mine owners, and shipping company officials had all been recruited or compromised, creating a web of protection that seemed impenetrable. One of the largest insurance providers in the eastern United States was the Eternal Life Insurance Company by 1875, with more than 15,000 active policies and annual revenues exceeding $2 million. Wealthy and respected members of society had become the Blackstone brothers, known for their charitable contributions and civic involvement. On the boards of 3 banks served Murray, and he had been appointed to a state commission studying industrial safety regulations. Treasurer of the American Insurance Association was Isaiah and a frequent speaker at business conferences. To the Pennsylvania state legislature had been elected Jebediah, and he was being mentioned as a potential candidate for Congress. Everything America believed about free enterprise and individual achievement seemed to be validated by their success. They were living proof that immigrants and outsiders could achieve extraordinary success through hard work, innovation, and dedication to serving their customers' needs. But success on such a massive scale inevitably attracted attention from people with the skills and resources to recognize patterns that local authorities had missed. For Lloyd's of London had Thomas Henley spent 15 years investigating insurance fraud before accepting a position with the New York Insurance Commission in 1873. To analyze industry statistics and identify companies that posed regulatory risks to the rapidly expanding American insurance market was his job. A meticulous researcher with advanced training in mathematics and statistics was Henley. Rare qualifications in an era when most insurance investigations relied on intuition and basic record-keeping. Several major fraud schemes in New York and Massachusetts had been exposed by his analytical methods, saving insurance companies hundreds of thousands of dollars and sending dozens of criminals to prison. In late 1875, Henley began noticing statistical anomalies in the mortality data reported by companies operating across multiple states. Mortality rates that varied predictably based on their customer demographics and geographic coverage areas were shown by most insurance companies. Low death rates were had by companies that insured primarily urban professionals, while those serving industrial workers experienced higher claims, but within expected parameters. Different was Eternal Life Insurance. Not only were their mortality rates higher than industry averages, but they fluctuated in ways that seemed to correlate with specific dates and locations rather than seasonal patterns or demographic trends. More puzzling, at statistically impossible rates, their death claims clustered around major industrial accidents and transportation disasters. Months spent Henley analyzing the data, cross-referencing newspaper reports of major accidents with Eternal Life's claim payments. So disturbing was what he discovered that he initially questioned his own calculations. Of the 8 major industrial disasters that had occurred in Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and Maryland between 1870 and 1875, an average of 68% of the fatalities were accounted for by Eternal Life policyholders. Despite representing less than 15% of the workforce in those regions, the probability of such consistent overrepresentation occurring by chance was less than 1 in 50,000. But statistical correlation, however compelling, was not legal evidence. Direct evidence of deliberate wrongdoing was needed by Henley, and that would require investigating the Blackstone brothers directly. What Thomas Henley didn't realize was that his inquiries had already been detected by Isaiah's network of informants within the insurance industry. By the time Henley began his investigation in earnest, the Blackstone brothers were already planning to eliminate this new threat to their empire. The most dangerous challenge the Blackstone family had ever faced would be brought by the winter of 1876, and their response would reveal the true depths of their criminal organization. A man easily intimidated was not Thomas Henley. During his years investigating fraud for Lloyd's of London, he had faced threats from some of Europe's most dangerous criminals, survived an assassination attempt in Naples, and watched corrupt officials try to destroy his career when his investigations threatened powerful interests. But as he delved deeper into the activities of Eternal Life Insurance, Henley began to realize he was confronting something far more sophisticated and deadly than anything he had encountered before. In February 1876, when Henley discovered a connection that had been hidden in plain sight, came the breakthrough. While reviewing shipping manifests from the Catherine and disaster, Henley noticed that 43 of the 67 passengers had purchased their insurance policies from the same agent, a man named Sean Murphy, who worked the immigrant docks in Pittsburgh. According to his employment records, Murphy had been working for Eternal Life for less than 3 months, but had already sold more than 200 policies to recent immigrants. To interview Murphy traveled Henley to Pittsburgh, only to discover that the man had disappeared 2 weeks after the Catherine and sinking, abandoning his boarding house room and leaving no forwarding address. That Murphy had left suddenly after receiving a visit from a well-dressed gentleman in an expensive carriage was mentioned by the landlord. More interesting was what Murphy had left behind, a trunk containing detailed records of his sales activities, including personal information about his customers that went far beyond standard insurance applications. With the thoroughness of a police investigator, Murphy had documented their work schedules, travel plans, family relationships, and financial circumstances. Hidden in the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in oiled cloth, Henley found something even more significant: correspondence between Murphy and his supervisors at Eternal Life, including coded telegrams that seemed to discuss special arrangements and elimination schedules. Particularly damning was one telegram dated just 3 days before the Catherine and disaster: harvest ready. 43 packages confirmed for river route. Proceed with orchard plan. Payment upon completion. Enough fraud cases had been worked by Henley to recognize criminal code when he saw it. Packages clearly referred to policyholders. River route was the Ohio River Steamboat Service, and orchard plan was some kind of systematic killing scheme. But more evidence was needed by him, and he needed to understand the full scope of the Blackstone operation. The most thorough investigation of his career was spent by Henley conducting over the next 6 months. Across 6 states to dozens of cities traveled he, interviewing survivors of industrial accidents, family members of disaster victims, and officials who had investigated suspicious deaths. He examined coroner reports, police files, insurance claims, and newspaper accounts, building a comprehensive picture of 30 years of systematic murder. Of staggering proportions was the criminal enterprise that emerged. Not simply killing individual policyholders had the Blackstone brothers been, they had been engineering mass casualty events designed to maximize insurance payouts while maintaining plausible deniability. Officials at every level of government had been corrupted by them, from small-town sheriffs to federal judges. A network of professional killers, saboteurs, and false witnesses that operated across multiple states with military precision had been created by them. Most horrifying of all, they had been eliminating entire families to prevent witnesses and reduce future complications. That more than 3,000 people had died as a direct result of Blackstone family activities was suggested by Henley's research, including hundreds of women and children who had posed no threat beyond their connection to insured workers. Enough evidence to support criminal charges against the Blackstone brothers that could send them to the gallows had been assembled by Henley by August 1876. But he also understood that his investigation had made him a marked man. In the form of a fire that consumed his hotel room in Cleveland while he was interviewing witnesses to the Riverside Bridge collapse came the first warning. At the Imperial Hotel for 3 days had Henley been staying, and the fire occurred on his final night, conveniently starting in his room while he was having dinner downstairs. That a gas lamp had apparently malfunctioned was profusely apologized for by the hotel manager, but Henley noticed that only his room had been affected and that his investigative files had been thoroughly searched before the fire started. More direct was the second warning. Outside the Pittsburgh courthouse where he had been examining records related to the Catherine and disaster, a man approached Henley. The stranger, well-dressed and soft-spoken, politely suggested that Henley might want to consider accepting a generous consulting position with a railroad company in California, a position that would require him to relocate immediately and indefinitely. "Mr. Henley," the man said with a smile that never reached his eyes, "some investigations can be very dangerous to one's health. Perhaps it would be wise to pursue opportunities in a more hospitable climate." The offer was declined by Henley. In the form of a telegram delivered to his hotel in Wheeling, West Virginia, came the third warning. "Your wife Margaret sends her regards from New York. She hopes you will conclude your business quickly and return home safely. Some neighborhoods can be very dangerous for ladies traveling alone." Cold ran Henley's blood. In Boston visiting her sister was Margaret supposed to be, not traveling anywhere near New York. The message was clear: the Blackstone brothers knew where his wife was, and they were prepared to harm her if he continued his investigation. But 15 years of investigating dangerous criminals had not been survived by Thomas Henley by backing down when threatened. Instead of retreating, he accelerated his timeline and began preparing for the most dangerous phase of his investigation: direct confrontation with the Blackstone brothers themselves. With federal prosecutors in Washington, D.C. arranged Henley to meet, presenting his evidence to Assistant Attorney General William Morrison in September 1876. A veteran prosecutor who had handled complex fraud cases during the post-Civil War Reconstruction, Morrison was initially skeptical of Henley's claims. Almost impossible to believe seemed the scope of the alleged conspiracy. "Mr. Henley," Morrison said after reviewing the files, "you're asking me to believe that 3 businessmen have orchestrated the murders of thousands of people across multiple states over a period of nearly 20 years, all while maintaining the appearance of respected citizens and successful entrepreneurs. Do you understand how extraordinary these allegations are?" "Perfectly, sir, I understand," Henley replied. "But I also understand that extraordinary crimes require extraordinary evidence, and that's exactly what I'm providing." 2 weeks spent Morrison reviewing Henley's documentation with a team of federal investigators. Compelling but circumstantial was the evidence: statistical patterns, suspicious coincidences, and coded communications that suggested criminal activity, but would be difficult to prove in court. "More is needed by us," Morrison concluded. "Direct evidence of criminal planning, documentary proof of the conspiracy, or testimony from someone inside the organization is what we need. Enough to justify an investigation is what you've assembled here, but not enough to secure convictions." This response had been anticipated by Henley. "2 more months give me," he said. "What we need, I believe I can get." The most dangerous gambit of his career was what Henley planned. He would attempt to infiltrate the Blackstone organization by posing as a corrupt official seeking to join their network. Using forged credentials and a carefully constructed false identity, Henley approached Sheriff Doughty in Mill Creek Township, claiming to be a federal court clerk who could provide advanced warning of any government investigations into insurance fraud. About pending federal cases in exchange for a substantial fee and potential partnership opportunities, he offered to sell information. Intrigued but cautious was Sheriff Doughty, who had been taking Blackstone money for more than 15 years. A meeting between Henley and Isaiah Blackstone was arranged by him, who would determine whether this potential new recruit was genuine or dangerous. In the back room of McGinty's Tavern in Mill Creek Township on October 23, 1876, the meeting took place. With 2 bodyguards arrived Isaiah Blackstone, men whose hard faces and watchful eyes suggested they were more than simple employees. Meticulously for this encounter had Henley prepared, studying every detail of federal court procedures and memorizing the names and backgrounds of dozens of officials who might plausibly be corrupted. As for a long moment studied him Isaiah, then nodded to one of his bodyguards. "To a private location where we can discuss specific arrangements will Marcus escort you. Quite generous, I think you'll find our terms." The engineer Marcus Kowalski, the same man who had sabotaged the Morgantown mine and the Riverside Bridge, was followed by Henley to a warehouse on the outskirts of town. Inside, the true headquarters of the Blackstone criminal organization was discovered by him. Detailed maps of 6 states were contained in the warehouse, marked with pins indicating the locations of major industrial facilities, transportation hubs, and population centers. Lining the walls were filing cabinets, filled with dossiers on thousands of eternal life policyholders, including their work schedules, family relationships, and personal vulnerabilities. Most chilling of all was a large table covered with architectural drawings and engineering schematics, plans for soaring through bridge supports, chemical formulas for accelerants and poisons, and detailed layouts of coal mines showing optimal locations for explosive charges. "Welcome to the real Eternal Life Insurance Company," Isaiah said as he gestured around the warehouse. "This is where we plan the tragedies that make our business so profitable." Over the next hour, a comprehensive overview of their operations was provided by Isaiah to Henley. How they identified target populations, planned mass casualty events, corrupted local officials, and eliminated potential witnesses was explained by him. Their network of professional killers, their methods for avoiding detection, and their strategies for expanding into new territories were detailed by him. Everything Henley needed to destroy the Blackstone empire it was. But he still faced the crucial challenge of surviving long enough to deliver the information to federal authorities. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Mill Creek Township intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. By the arrival of Marai and Jebediah Blackstone, Isaiah's confession was interrupted, who had come to evaluate their potential new recruit personally. Now 59 years old and bearing the commanding presence of a man accustomed to absolute authority, Marai studied Henley with the intensity of a predator assessing prey. "My brother tells me you might be useful to our organization," Marai said. "But trust requires demonstration, and usefulness requires trust. A test of your commitment to our shared interests is a small project that needs our attention." A photograph of a middle-aged man with kind eyes and graying hair was handed to Henley by Marai. "This is Dr. Marcus Webb, a physician in Johntown, who has been asking inconvenient questions about some of our former policyholders. About patterns he's detected in local mortality statistics. Dr. Webb seems to believe that certain industrial accidents in his area have been artificially induced. He's been corresponding with officials in Harrisburg, sharing his theories." Cold ran Henley's blood as he realized what was being asked of him. "A complication that requires resolution has Dr. Webb become," Marai continued. "Someone with federal connections to ensure that his concerns are dismissed by the appropriate authorities is needed by us. In this matter, can we count on your cooperation?" "Of course," Henley managed to reply, though his mouth had gone dry. "What specifically do you need me to do?" Before a state legislative committee next week, Dr. Webb is scheduled to testify, Jebediah interjected. "Of systematic insurance fraud connected to industrial accidents in western Pennsylvania, he believes he has evidence. Before it can damage our reputation, we need that testimony to be discredited." Forward leaned Marai, his steel-gray eyes boring into Henley's. "More importantly, we need Dr. Webb to understand that pursuing this investigation would be extremely dangerous to his health and the well-being of his family. Sometimes a word from the right federal official can be very persuasive in encouraging people to reconsider their civic obligations. That he was being asked to participate in the intimidation or elimination of a man whose only crime was trying to expose the truth about the Blackstone murders was realized by Henley. A test of his loyalty it was, but it was also an opportunity to gather even more evidence while potentially saving Dr. Webb's life. "I can handle this," Henley said, "but to determine the best approach for discrediting him, I'll need detailed information about Dr. Webb's evidence and testimony." A thick file containing copies of Dr. Webb's correspondence, his research notes, and transcripts of his preliminary interviews with state investigators was produced by Isaiah. As Henley reviewed the documents, he realized that many of the same conclusions about the Blackstone operations had been independently reached by Dr. Webb, though his evidence was less comprehensive than Henley's own investigation. More importantly, for November 15, 1876, less than 3 weeks away, Dr. Webb had scheduled his testimony. Before that hearing, Dr. Webb must be neutralized, Marai stated flatly. "Federal investigations that would be very inconvenient for our business operations could be triggered if his testimony becomes public." A nod was given by Henley, understanding that he had perhaps 2 weeks to complete his infiltration, gather the final evidence he needed, and escape with his life before his true identity was discovered by the Blackstone brothers. What he didn't realize was that his time was already running out. A cautious man who trusted no one completely was Isaiah Blackstone, and he had already begun investigating Walter Henderson's background. Within days, he would discover that no such person worked for the federal court system in Philadelphia, and that questions about eternal life insurance in multiple cities across several states had been asked by Thomas Henley. The final confrontation between Henley and the Blackstone family was approaching, and only one side would survive the encounter. November 8, 1876. Gray and bitter, the autumn morning dawned in Mill Creek Township, with frost covering the windows of the houses along Elm Street and smoke rising from chimneys throughout the valley. A sleepless night in his hotel room had been spent by Thomas Henley, reviewing his evidence and preparing for what he knew would be the most dangerous day of his life. That Walter Henderson was expected at the warehouse at 9 o'clock sharp for a final briefing on the Dr. Webb situation had been sent word by Isaiah Blackstone the previous evening. By Marcus Kowalski had the message been delivered, whose cold smile and meaningful glances suggested that something had changed in the Blackstone brothers' assessment of their new recruit. The overnight hours had been used by Henley to prepare multiple copies of his evidence, sealing them in envelopes addressed to federal prosecutors, newspaper editors, and insurance commissioners across the eastern United States. If he didn't survive the morning, at least the truth about the Blackstone crimes would eventually reach people with the power to act on it. At 8:30, his way to the warehouse on the outskirts of town was made by Henley, carrying a leather satchel that contained both genuine federal court documents he had forged and a loaded Colt revolver he prayed he wouldn't need to use. At that hour, the streets were mostly empty, with only a few workers heading to their jobs at the foundry and the railroad yard. Deserted when Henley arrived appeared the warehouse, but he could see smoke rising from the chimney and lamplight flickering in the windows. From the shadows as he approached the main entrance, Marcus Kowalski emerged, accompanied by two other men Henley didn't recognize. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson," Kowalski said with mock politeness. "For you inside, the Blackstone brothers are waiting. Very educational. I think you'll find today's meeting." Everything he needed to know was told to Henley by the tone of voice and the positioning of the men. His cover had been blown, and he was walking into a trap. But now he had come too far to retreat, and what happened in the next few hours might depend on Dr. Webb's life. Inside the warehouse, all three Blackstone brothers waiting for him around the large table that held their operational maps and planning documents were found by Henley. But very different from his previous visit was the atmosphere. Gone was the welcoming tone and collegial discussion. Instead, with the cold calculation of men preparing to dispose of a problem, Marai, Isaiah, and Jebediah watched him. "Mr. Henderson," Marai said, not bothering to rise from his chair, "or should I say Mr. Thomas Henley of the New York Insurance Commission?" Instinctively toward his concealed weapon moved Henley's hand, but he forced himself to remain calm. "What you're talking about, I'm afraid I don't know." A laugh without warmth or humor was given by Isaiah. "Please, Mr. Henley, for weeks we've known about your investigation. Without us discovering your true identity, did you really think you could infiltrate our organization? From Boston to Chicago, we have contacts in every major city. As an insurance investigator, your reputation precedes you." Forward leaned Jebediah, his political smile replaced by an expression of genuine malice. "The question isn't whether you're Thomas Henley. The question is what we're going to do with you now that you've learned so much about our business operations." That further deception was pointless was realized by Henley. "What I've learned is that you're murderers on a scale that defies comprehension. So you could collect insurance money, 3,000 people dead. To cover your tracks, entire families eliminated. You're not businessmen, you're monsters." With anger flashed Marai's eyes, but his voice remained controlled. "Monsters. Entrepreneurs we are, Mr. Henley. A market inefficiency we identified and innovative solutions to exploit it we developed. On the premise that most policyholders would pay premiums for years without ever filing claims was the insurance industry built. Ways to ensure that our customers' premiums generated immediate returns we simply found. By murdering them," Henley said flatly. "By accelerating natural economic processes," Isaiah corrected. "In accidents every day, industrial workers die. To disease and misfortune constantly, immigrants succumb. Focus and efficiency to inevitable outcomes we merely provided." Stood and walked to one of the filing cabinets Jebediah, withdrawing a thick folder. "The beautiful thing about our system, Mr. Henley, is its scalability. With minimal risk of detection, we've proven that mass casualty events can be engineered. Coal mine explosions, bridge collapses, steamboat accidents, all tragic but explicable within the normal parameters of industrial life." "What's your point?" Henley asked, though he suspected he didn't want to hear the answer. For the first time since Henley's arrival, Marai smiled. "Our point, Mr. Henley, is that we're expanding our operations. Anywhere in America can be applied the techniques we've perfected in Pennsylvania. In California, Texas, and the Dakota Territory, we're planning to establish eternal life insurance offices. Annually, we expect to be processing more than 1,000 death claims within 10 years. Breathtaking in its evil was the scope of their ambition. A criminal enterprise they weren't just running, they were planning to industrialize murder on a national scale. "You're insane," Henley said. "Without being detected, you can't possibly believe you can continue this. Managed by experts we've recruited from the finest universities, will the statistical patterns alone," Isaiah interrupted. "From our mistakes we've learned, Mr. Henley. To ensure that our mortality rates remain within acceptable parameters, future operations will include sophisticated mathematical modeling. Through trial and error, stumbling amateur criminals we're not, proven methodologies implementing professionals we are." A chill that had nothing to do with the November weather was felt by Henley. Just killers weren't the Blackstone brothers, they were systematic, intelligent killers who had learned to perfect their methods over decades of practice. While maintaining the facade of legitimate business, they could potentially murder tens of thousands of Americans if they succeeded in expanding their operations nationally. "But first," Marai continued, "the immediate problems created by your investigation we need to address: Dr. Webb's testimony, your evidence files, and your personal knowledge of our operations." While the brothers were talking, to block the warehouse exits had moved Marcus Kowalski and his associates. Trapped was Henley, but he wasn't helpless. To federal prosecutors, "My evidence has already been delivered," Henley lied smoothly. "The investigation won't be stopped by killing me." "Actually, it will," Jebediah said with his politician's confidence. "For weeks, we've been monitoring your activities, Mr. Henley. What evidence you've gathered and where you've stored it, we know exactly. Last night while you were sleeping quite soundly, thanks to the laudanum our associate added to your dinner, your hotel room was searched. Confiscated have been your evidence files, and intercepted by our contacts in the Postal Service has been any correspondence you may have sent to federal authorities." Sank Henley's heart. If they had destroyed his evidence and intercepted his communications, Dr. Webb would testify without warning about the danger he faced, and the Blackstone operation would continue unimpeded. But on a single plan, 15 years of dangerous investigations had not been survived by Thomas Henley by relying. While the Blackstone brothers had been searching his hotel room and intercepting his mail, a backup strategy that they couldn't have anticipated had been implemented by Henley. "You may have found my evidence files," Henley said, "but everything you didn't find." Slightly flickered Marai's confident expression. "What do you mean?" Slowly into his satchel reached Henley, withdrawing not his concealed weapon, but a small leather journal. "Detailed records of every conversation I've had with your organization are contained in this, including everything you've told me about your operations, your methods, and your plans for expansion. Also contained are the names and locations of every corrupted official in your network, every professional killer you employ, and every planned operation you've discussed." Pale had gone Isaiah's face. "Impossible, that is. Everything we searched. Everything I wanted you to find, you searched," Henley replied. "But the things I mailed to myself under false names at post office boxes in 6 different cities, you didn't search. Just one copy is this journal. Along with photographs of your operational maps and copies of your correspondence with agents and killers, there are 5 others." Except for the sound of wind rattling the windows, the warehouse fell silent. That their perfect criminal organization had been completely compromised by a single persistent investigator were realizing the Blackstone brothers. "Even if you kill me here," Henley continued, "according to a predetermined schedule, those packages will be collected. On the East Coast, every federal prosecutor and newspaper editor will have complete documentation of your crimes by Christmas." The first to recover from the shock was Marai. "Bluffing you are. To theft or loss by mailing it to random locations, no investigator would risk exposing evidence." "You're right," Henley agreed. "That risk no normal investigator would take. But normal criminals I'm not investigating. Who have killed thousands of people and corrupted officials at every level of government, I'm investigating murderers. Against an enemy like that, justified are extraordinary measures." That Henley had indeed mailed evidence packages to secure locations was the truth, but he had also taken one additional precaution that the Blackstone brothers couldn't have discovered. To Washington, D.C. under an assumed name, he had arranged for Margaret, his wife, to travel, carrying the most crucial evidence directly to Assistant Attorney General Morrison. If Henley failed to return to New York by November 15, to deliver the evidence and request immediate federal intervention had Margaret instructions. A bluff designed to discover whether the Blackstone brothers were monitoring his personal communications had been the telegram about her being in New York. "So, here's what's going to happen," Henley said, his voice steady despite the mortal danger he faced. "Out of this warehouse, you're going to let me walk, and immediately, you're going to cease all operations. Without interference, Dr. Webb will give his testimony, and to federal authorities for prosecution, you'll surrender yourselves." Harsh and bitter was Marai's laugh. "Your situation, you seem to misunderstand, Mr. Henley. As you claim, even if you've hidden evidence, to see it delivered alive you won't be. About what they've discovered, dead men can't testify. But living men can," Henley replied. "And about your crimes, I'm not the only person who knows." Partially true and partially bluff was that statement. Similar conclusions about the Blackstone operations had indeed been reached by Dr. Webb, though he lacked Henley's comprehensive evidence. More importantly, of the investigation was already aware Assistant Attorney General Morrison and would certainly act if under suspicious circumstances Henley disappeared. But something the Blackstone brothers couldn't have anticipated was Henley's main protection. By federal agents who had followed Henley from his hotel was the warehouse meeting being observed. Sufficiently concerned about Henley's safety had Morrison been to assign a small team of investigators to monitor the final phase of his infiltration. Outside the warehouse with instructions to intervene if Henley's life appeared to be in immediate danger, they were positioned. That intervention was about to begin was indicated by the sound of footsteps on the warehouse roof. The crash of breaking glass as federal agents rappelled through the skylights followed the footsteps above, landing in the warehouse with military precision. While two more secured the exits, trapping Marcus Kowalski and his associates before they could escape, 3 armed men in dark coats surrounded the Blackstone brothers. Federal agents shouted the lead investigator, a tall man with iron-gray hair and the bearing of a veteran soldier. "Nobody move." Different responses to this sudden reversal of fortune were reflected in the Blackstone brothers' faces. Even with a federal rifle pointed at his chest, Marai maintained his commanding presence, his steel-gray eyes calculating odds and possibilities. As if his mathematical mind couldn't process how his carefully planned operation had been compromised so completely, Isaiah appeared stunned. Immediately raised his hands and began speaking in the smooth, conciliatory tone he used with hostile voters. "Jebediah, ever the politician. Gentlemen, some misunderstanding here there seems to be," he said. "About insurance matters, we're respected businessmen conducting a routine meeting with Mr. Henderson. Whatever you think you've witnessed." "Enough we've witnessed," the lead agent interrupted. "Agent Daniel Foster, U.S. Treasury Department. Thomas Henley, are you injured?" "I'm fine, Agent Foster," Henley replied, though his hands were shaking slightly from the tension of the past hour. "But before anyone has a chance to destroy it, you'll want to secure the evidence in this warehouse." To his men who immediately began collecting the operational maps, filing cabinets, and planning documents that filled the warehouse, a nod was given by Foster. Staggering was the scope of evidence, detailed records of 37 years of systematic murder, corruption, and fraud that would require months to analyze completely. As federal agents placed the Blackstone brothers in shackles, finally spoke directly to Henley Marai. "Something here you think you've won, Mr. Henley, but what you've unleashed you have no idea. Far beyond these 3 men and this single warehouse extends our organization. In a dozen states, we have associates, in federal offices, contacts, and resources you can't imagine. Then plenty of work to do I guess we'll have," Foster replied grimly. With the list of corrupted officials Mr. Henley discovered during his investigation, starting. The beginning of the largest criminal investigation in American history to that point were the arrests only. Over the following 18 months, more than 200 people connected to the Blackstone conspiracy would be arrested by federal agents, including sheriffs, coroners, judges, mine owners, railroad executives, and dozens of professional killers and saboteurs. The full scope of the Blackstone empire to a horrified American public was revealed by the trials, which began in Philadelphia in March 1877. Extensive and graphic was newspaper coverage of the proceedings, with reporters struggling to convey the sheer scale of the crimes to readers who could barely comprehend such systematic evil. Detailed documentation of 63 mass casualty events orchestrated by the Blackstone organization between 1859 and 1876 was included in the evidence presented during the trials. The lives of 2,847 people had been claimed by these disasters, including 1,923 primary policyholders and 924 family members who had been eliminated to prevent witnesses or complications. Equally staggering was the financial scope. More than $4.2 million in fraudulent insurance claims had been collected by the Blackstone brothers while paying only $890,000 in bribes, equipment, and operational expenses. From 17 years of systematic murder, their net profit exceeded $3.3 million, an astronomical sum equivalent to more than $80 million in today's currency. Perhaps most chilling were the expansion plans discovered in Isaiah's personal files. In California, Texas, Colorado, and the Dakota Territory, operations had been being prepared for establishment by the brothers, with projected annual revenues of more than $10 million by 1885. While building one of the largest fortunes in the nation, they might have murdered tens of thousands of Americans if their plans had succeeded. On 47 counts of murder was convicted Macabre Blackstone and sentenced to death. In Philadelphia on September 12, 1878, he was executed by hanging, maintaining his innocence to the end and claiming he was a victim of government persecution designed to suppress business innovation. A similar sentence was received by Isaiah Blackstone, but before his execution date, he died in prison, apparently from a heart attack brought on by the stress of his incarceration. Though no evidence was ever found to support that theory, suicide was suspected by some. Of conspiracy was convicted Jebediah Blackstone, whose political connections and cooperation with prosecutors earned him a reduced sentence, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. In Eastern State Penitentiary in 1894, he died, having spent his final years writing detailed confessions that provided investigators with additional evidence about the organization's methods and scope. Varying fates were faced by the corrupted officials connected to the Blackstone conspiracy. Of accepting bribes was convicted Sheriff Marcus Doughty and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Stripped of his medical license and sentenced to 15 years was Drive James Morrison, who had falsified coroner reports. From office, several judges and federal officials were impeached and removed. More difficult to prosecute proved the professional killers and saboteurs. As to Canada or Mexico had many fled when news of the arrests became public. In Toronto was captured the engineer Marcus Kowalski and extradited to face trial for the Morgantown mine disaster. In West Virginia in 1879, he was executed. Never found was Patrick the Torch McGillicuddy, though from California to South America, reports placed him in various locations. A crucial role in the prosecutions was played by Dr. Marcus Webb, the Johnstown physician whose scheduled testimony had precipitated the final confrontation. Corroborating evidence for many of Henley's discoveries was provided by his independent research and helped establish the timeline of Blackstone crimes in western Pennsylvania. By federal order was dissolved the Eternal Life Insurance Company, with its remaining assets used to provide compensation to the families of verified victims. More than 5 years took the process of identifying and compensating all the victims and required the creation of a special federal commission dedicated to unraveling the complex web of crimes. The Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Rutherford B. Hayes in recognition of his courage and persistence in exposing the conspiracy was awarded to Thomas Henley. As an insurance investigator, he continued his career, but never again did he encounter a case that approached the scope and horror of the Blackstone murders. On the broader implications of the case reflected Henley in his later writings. For so long had the Blackstone conspiracy succeeded, not because of superior criminal intelligence, but because of systematic corruption that pervaded American institutions at every level. Bought had been local officials, intimidated had been state authorities, and minimal had been federal oversight. Significant reforms in insurance regulation, criminal investigation procedures, and interstate law enforcement cooperation were led to buy the case. Much more difficult for similar conspiracies to operate undetected was made by the creation of standardized mortality statistics and improved communication between state and federal authorities. But perhaps the most important lesson of the Blackstone case was one that Americans have had to relearn repeatedly throughout their history: the danger of assuming that respectability and success are synonymous with honesty and morality. Pillars of their community, devout churchgoers, successful businessmen, and trusted public servants had been the Blackstone brothers. Not just by corruption and intimidation had their crimes been hidden, but by the natural human tendency to assume that people who appear prosperous and respectable must be fundamentally decent. For 37 years, their most precious possessions had been trusted by the good people of Mill Creek Township and dozens of other communities to the Blackstone family: their lives, their family security, and their faith in American institutions. With systematic murder on a scale that wouldn't be equaled in American criminal history until the organized crime syndicates of the early 20th century had that trust been repaid. Unmarked to this day remain the Blackstone family graves in Mill Creek Township Cemetery, though about the events of 1876, local residents still speak in hushed tones. Over the decades, various businesses has housed the Eternal Life Insurance Company building on Main Street, but none have lasted more than a few years. Cursed is the building, say some. That it's difficult to attract customers to a location associated with such horror, others simply note. In 1881 was demolished the warehouse where the final confrontation took place, and a small park with a memorial to the victims of the Blackstone conspiracy is now occupied by the site. The names of 2,847 confirmed victims are listed by the memorial, though significantly higher may have been the actual number, believe historians. That the greatest evils often wear the most respectable faces is shown to us by this mystery, and that the price of safety is constant vigilance against those who would exploit our trust for their own murderous gain. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about the Blackstone conspiracy? Or do you think some secrets went to the grave with the brothers? Leave your comment below and share your theories. If you enjoyed this tale and want more dark historical mysteries like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves uncovering the hidden horrors of America's past. These stories need to be told, and together, we can ensure that the victims of history's greatest crimes are never forgotten. In the next video, see you, where we'll explore another dark chapter that powerful people tried to erase from the historical record.